One thing that never fails to terrify me is when someone goes missing in the woods, and that's what happened to this Boy Scout. But this isn't just a typical missing person case, because after he disappeared, his fellow Boy Scouts went looking for him, and they all heard this strange whistling deep in the forest. They thought it was their missing friend, but it wasn't. And to this day, that whistling and who or what it came from has never been explained. They also reported seeing members of a sect walking through the woods in the middle of the night, right before this little boy disappeared. There are so many disturbing aspects to this case, and it is still unsolved. This is the mysterious disappearance of Marco Aurelio Simon, and it's one of the few cases that truly make me believe that something sinister is lurking out there, deep in the forest. So let's talk about it. Marco Aurelio Simon was 15 years old when he mysteriously disappeared on June 8, 1985. He lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil with his parents and twin brother. He was described as a pretty shy teenager, but still he had a lot of friends, and he had just become a senior Boy Scout. He was super excited for an upcoming Boy Scouts trip with his fellow scouts, where they were going to hike the Pico dos Marins, a really beautiful mountain range in Brazil. This mountain has one of the highest peaks in the state, and although it is pretty rugged and remote, it's not outrageous, and you don't need any special equipment or anything like that to hike it. On June 7th, 1985, Marco, 3 of his scouts, and their leader Juan set out for the small city of Piquete. Marco waved goodbye to his family, which kind of sucked for his twin brother because he was supposed to go on that trip as well. But at the last minute, he got sick and had to stay home. Little did anyone know at the time, though, that this would be the last time they would ever see Marco. Once they got into the mountains, the group set up their tents at the base of the camp. There they met a local tour guide who lived in a house nearby and knew the area pretty well, and this tour guide said that this area was a good spot to camp out for the night. After setting up their tents, the group went to a nearby river and started swimming. But once they got back to the campsite, they noticed that all of their tents and personal belongings were messed with. Everything was kind of strewn about, and it was obvious that their stuff had been gone through. So they asked the local tour guide that they met earlier if he saw anything. He said no, but it could be possible that the local dogs in the area ransacked their stuff. They kind of disregarded this and brushed it off as just being nothing. Later that night, the temperature dropped and it was really cold, so they built a fire, had dinner, and all settled into their tents, ready to doze off. They were all looking forward to hiking the mountain the next day, but it was that night that things started to get strange. The entire night, the Boy Scouts felt as if they were being watched. You know that really heavy feeling of dread that you just can't shake because it feels like someone is secretly watching you? That's what they all felt. Then one of the scouts saw someone walk by their tent, and at this point it was the middle of the night, so no one should have been up and out. Then Scout Leader Juan heard and felt someone physically hit his tent, but when he looked out to see if anyone was there, he found nothing. The next morning, all of the Boy Scouts talked about what happened that night, and they all shared the same experience of feeling like they were being watched and seeing things or people outside. Again though, they kind of just brushed this off, and eager to start their hike, they took off for the Pico dos Marins. This mountain is pretty steep, and it typically takes about 5 hours to reach the top, but about halfway through at around 2 p.m., one of the Boy Scouts stepped into a hole and injured his knee, and he was in so much pain that he couldn't walk any further. So Juan and the other scouts built a makeshift stretcher to take him back to camp. So he offered to go ahead of the group and cut the path in order to get back faster and get some help. All of the Boy Scouts said that this was a bad idea and that they should all remain together, but after much persistence, group leader Juan said yes and let him go. Juan told him to take some chalk and mark the rocks he passes with the number 240, which was their scout number. So Marco did, and the scouts could see him a few meters down in the distance. There was a big rock on the path that split the trail into two, and the scouts saw Marco go left out of sight. Marco would disappear after this, and what happened next has never been explained. As the group started down the path, they saw 3 rocks with the number 240 written on them with chalk, and when they got to the fork in the path, they all wanted to go left because it was clear that Marco had gone left, and if they did go left, it would have been a much faster trip back to camp. But for some reason, Juan insisted they go right. He tried telling them that going left would be too hard carrying someone, and not to worry because the paths would loop around and meet up ahead, and that they would see Marco at the end of the path. But this was not true, and the paths did not loop together, so why he said that, no one knows. The boys said they should follow Marco's path, but with Juan being the leader, they were forced to go right. This path took way longer, and they didn't reach their camp until 5 a.m. the next day, and by then it was freezing out. There, they hoped to see Marco at the campsite, but instead they only found his backpack, which was open and in disarray outside of his tent. This was odd to the scouts because before they left, they all left their backpacks neatly closed inside their tents. Seeing as though Marco was nowhere to be found, it's never actually been proven if he made it back to the campsite or not, or if he was the one to do that to his backpack. Juan went back into the mountains to search for Marco, and he looked for about 5 hours, but when he still couldn't find him, he was reported missing to the police. For the next month, police, along with over 300 volunteers, searched the mountain for Marco. This included military police, search and rescue, tracking dogs, and even helicopters, but not a single trace of Marco was ever found. And this was an intense search too, one of the largest ever conducted in the country, but still, nothing was found. Not even his clothing or any of his gear that he had on him that day. But this is where things start to get really disturbing. So on the second night of the search, all of the Boy Scouts that were with Marco that day were camped out near where he went missing, since they were also helping in the search. They were all about to fall asleep that night when they started hearing this really strange whistling coming from deep in the forest. Since they were all Boy Scouts, they figured that this could be Marco whistling to try and get someone's attention. So they all went to where this whistling was coming from. And when they got there, 3 big blue flashes lit up the area. And according to them, it looked like it was coming from the sky. They were all freaked out, but they still tried calling and whistling for Marco, but they never got a response. And to this day, Marco remains missing. Although we don't know what really happened to him, there are a few theories, some wild, some not. Theory number 1 is that he was abducted by extraterrestrials. I know this sounds crazy, but a lot of people back then thought that this was a real possibility, even his own parents. I guess this mountain region is known to have a lot of magnetic power, and with the whistling and blue lights in the sky, some think that he could have been abducted by aliens. Theory number 2 is that Marco was kidnapped by a sect in the area known as the Blue Butterflies. I can't find much of anything on this sect, but the local tour guide who lived in the area and interacted with the scout group that day did report seeing members of this sect walking through the woods in the middle of the night, right before Marco disappeared. But as creepy as this sounds, police found no evidence linking this group to Marco's disappearance. Theory number 3 is that Marco was kidnapped by an older woman. I guess a local boy saw Marco after he disappeared in a truck being driven by an older woman. The police were able to track this truck and woman down in a neighboring city, and so it turned out that this did exist and was real. But on the day of Marco's disappearance, the truck never left the city, and so this was ruled out. Theories number 4 and 5 are that Marco was either attacked by a wild animal or simply just got lost and succumbed to the elements. But there's no evidence of this either. No sign of blood or torn clothing, just nothing. Locals in the area do say though that it would be hard to get lost, because although it is rugged terrain, you can clearly see a city off in the distance, which if you got lost, you could easily get to. And of course, the last theory is that Scout leader Juan had something to do with it. He did become a suspect early on in the investigation, but police found no evidence that he had anything to do with Marco's disappearance. He was found to be more irresponsible, if anything, although some things don't add up with him. It's odd he insisted they take a different path than Marco that day. If Marco had gotten back safely and found help, it would have been hard to find the group if they were on a completely different path. Juan was also reportedly expelled from another scout group in the past for misconduct, and it's weird that he went alone to look for Marco for 5 hours before reporting him missing. Another odd thing that I wanted to mention about this case is that on the same day that Marco went missing, his family was on a ranch in a completely different city. But out of nowhere, his mom got a really horrible feeling that something bad happened to Marco, so much so that she made her family go home early because of it. She then reached out to Scout leader Juan's family, since they knew each other, to see where exactly the group was at. This was hours before Juan even reported Marco missing. And it's just crazy to me that a mother's intuition can be so strong. Sadly, she died in 2015 without ever knowing what happened to her son. The Boy Scout who was injured on that trip grew up to become a police officer who specializes in missing person cases, because Marco's disappearance really affected him. This case was closed in 1990 as no evidence has ever surfaced, but it's now been 40 years, and whatever happened to Marco in those mountains remains a mystery.